Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Simmons. I am Ecosystem Strategy Lead at Tidelift, as Todd mentioned. I'm also president of the Open Source Initiative, one of the foundations that I'm going to be talking to you about today. I got to say, I'm a little feel a little scattered because in that last keynote, I was just fanboying about Urima's talk. It's so important to prioritize culture as we build our communities. It's just critical. So thank you, Urima. So a little bit more about myself. So yes, day job, Tidelift. I'm president of the Open Source Initiative. It's a volunteer role I've held on the board of directors for about 5 years, elected president last year. Another hat that I wear is as co-organizer of North Bay Python, the cutest damn little Python conference ever. It's a nonprofit tech conference we hold here in Petaluma, where I live, which I should recognize that I'm calling in today from Petaluma, California. This is land of the Coast Miwok. So today I'm here to talk to you about, as Todd mentioned, the foundations of open source. It's a little bit of a play on words. It's not great, but here's the thing. I came to open source really late in my career. I started as a web developer when I was still in school. I was trying to work my way through school, realized that I couldn't afford it, couldn't get all the loans, wasn't earning enough income, but I had a career, I had a trade skill on my hands. So I decided, okay, I'll drop out of college. I'll try this web development thing for a bit. Well, my web development career blew up and I was using a lot of Drupal, a lot of WordPress, Bootstrap and jQuery entered the scene somewhere midway through my early web development career there. And it was interesting. I never really thought much about it. I never thought that anything novel was really going on. To me, as somebody who grew up with like the advent of the internet, or rather the advent of the World Wide Web, with peer-to-peer file sharing, to me, open source just felt like a natural extension of that culture that I was already used to. It didn't occur to me that there was anything really special going on. And as a web developer, I'm not alone in that. I'm not alone in that experience. Web developers are arguably the single largest block of developers, of open source developers on the planet. And yet it's very, very easy to go through one's career without realizing that anything special is going on, without realizing why it is that I can sell a Drupal or sell a WordPress. So part of my career was being a community manager, community organizer. And in about 2013, I had the great fortune to be hired as O'Reilly Media's community manager for open source and for web technology. And it was like being hit by a freight train. Like it was just, in a good way, really revelatory just how much there was behind this term open source that I had never bothered to interrogate over the first decade of my career. And so I say this to let you know that if you don't know a lot about some of the things I'm going to tell you about today, that's okay. You're in good company. So today, I'm just going to talk through a few of the key questions that can reveal to us what the foundations of open source are, who they are, what they do, why they matter. First, who are these nonprofits? Who are these foundations? And yes, they are primarily nonprofits. Many of them incorporated in the United States, but there are some incorporated in Canada, some incorporated around Europe, some in Australia. Open Source Initiative is one of those foundations. We also have Software Freedom Conservancy, Python Software Foundation for the Python language, OpenJS Foundation for JavaScript frameworks, the .NET Foundation for .NET projects and language, the Apache Software Foundation for so many projects, including the Apache Web Server that I built my career on, the Eclipse Foundation, the Linux Foundation. And no, I don't have slides. This is a conversation. The Linux Foundation, Linux Australia, the Open Infrastructure Foundation, GNOME, Django, Drupal, WordPress, so on and so forth. These days, you could even include IEEE and OASIS, venerable standards organizations, among this list of foundations. There are dozens of foundations globally, perhaps over 100 depending on how you count them. Most people only consciously interact with a few over the course of their careers, depending on what corner of the industry that you're in. Okay, so what? I've rattled off maybe 12.5 foundations. What do they do? Briefly, these foundations keep the open in open source through advocacy, through standards, and through something extremely important and with a wonky label, fiscal sponsorship. So let's talk about a few of these foundations. I'll start with Open Source Initiative, the 23-year-old nonprofit that was founded to promote and protect open source. It acts as a standards and advocacy body. The standard that matters for the Open Source Initiative is the open source definition. Now, I told you I came to open source late. It took me 10, maybe 13 years before I realized that open source has a definition. It's not just that I can look at the source code, that I can see it. It is literally a 10-point definition that includes things like, that includes a number of measures that ensure that the software or any software using a license that meets the open source definition gives us certain privileges, certain rights. I've got this fabulous scarf in the background that you probably can't get a good look at, but it says, you know, use, the right to use software, the right to study, to look at the source code, the right to modify the software. I can make changes to it. But not only the rights to use, study, and modify, but also the right to distribute, to redistribute that software and the changes that I've made to it. And those are 4 key rights that we get with open source software. And those rights are captured through the open source definition, which is the measuring stick. It's the ruler that OSI uses to evaluate licenses. So like most standards bodies, there is a public process by which we apply the open source definition. And that's the license review process. So for as long as OSI has been around, we've had a license review process, which is it's basically a public mailing list that interested people can join. You can join it yourself if you're curious. And through that license review process, when new people come up with new licenses, they will submit it to that process. There was a community of people, including OSI members, but primarily not, who will vet that license, turn it over, scrutinize it, and eventually come to a decision whether the community sees it as conformant with the open source definition. And if it is, great, we have a new open source license on our hands. This is the legal janitorial work that legal professionals at for-profit companies, at humanitarian organizations, and at government agencies all rely on. There's internal documentation and policy and processes at organizations all over the globe that by reference incorporate the open source initiative list of approved licenses and the open source definition. Having a reliable and predictable license standard means that they don't need to do the expensive manual legal review of every single third-party software component. You know, if you work particularly in the JavaScript space, you know just how many packages a single project can involve. If you had to review the license on every single one of those in a manual fashion, this just wouldn't pan out. This means that independent professionals, small businesses, researchers, hobbyists can all feel confident that their use of a given piece of software is on the up and up. In addition to managing the open source definition, OSI also advocates at standards and governmental bodies all over the globe to ensure that open source is a licensing standard we can continue to rely on. Now, some other foundations do advocacy as work. especially software freedom conservancy, one of my favorites. Conservancy fights for user freedom and copyleft licensing, which is a type of open source licensing. Conservancy also provides a home for some of the most widely used open source projects in existence, such as Git, Selenium, Homebrew, OpenWRT, and Samba. Now, providing a home for open source projects like that, that's what's called fiscal sponsorship. And it's an important function of literally all of the nonprofits that I'm talking about here today. When you've got an open source project and you've got this community asset, sure, there's an open source license on the code so that everybody can use it. But how do you pay for an event or for a meetup that you want to host around your project? How do you receive funds to pay for your hosting costs or the cost of your continuous deployment and integration pipeline? Well, if you have a fiscal sponsor, that is a nonprofit entity that will hold that bank account open for you, that will hold onto those funds for you, that will employ an accountant to manage those funds, to do the accounts receivable, the accounts payable, and to do the tax filings. Because I'm willing to bet, whether or not you've ever started an open source project, if and when you do, you probably don't also want to have additional tax filings on your hand. That's what fiscal sponsors do. Not only do they do that, they'll provide legal support, IP aggregation, and technical infrastructure as well for whatever that project needs. So recapping, what do these foundations do? They do a lot. They do a lot. But it really comes down to standards, advocacy, and fiscal sponsorship. And fiscal sponsorship is the thing that, to me, is just so essential and so under-recognized. So why does any of this matter? Why does the future of open source and our livelihoods, or at least mine, I certainly this is my career in this space. Why does the future of open source and our livelihoods rest on the continued existence of these nonprofits? To answer that question, I want to zoom out just a little bit. When people talk about open source, they usually mean several things at once. Open source as a term has been overloaded with multiple layers of meaning. It's frankly a sign of success, but it's also a challenge. In my mind, there are at least 3 layers of meaning that we usually imply when we say open source. There's whether something has an open source license on it. Is a piece of software open source? Does it have an open source license? Then yes. Then there's open collaboration, which is the kind of collaboration, the kind of environment that we have grown used to with open source, where you've got your project and I can add issues to it. I can submit pull requests or change requests. I'm able to interact with your project and contribute to it. So you have the open license, the open source license, we have the open collaboration, and then there's also open governance. And open governance is so critical. It ensures that it's very clear how these projects are managed. What's the on-ramp to becoming not just a contributor, but having the commit bit, being a maintainer. How is it that technical decisions are made? How do you decide what the roadmap for the project is? What's in scope and what's out of scope? That's all governance. And so with open source, there are these multiple layers. When we say open source, often we're referring to projects that are both open source licensed, have an open collaboration model, and have open governance. But there are lots of projects that don't meet all those criteria that are still technically open source. One example is the Android open source project. The thing that's running on my mobile phone here. Yes, it's an open source licensed project, but no, Google doesn't accept contributions from other people, unless maybe you're an OEM. So it's an open source project, but there's no open collaboration, and there's certainly no open governance. So it's really important to understand what we mean when we say open source. What layers of meaning are we implying in that? And to be explicit about that. You've got the news recently. You've probably heard about companies relicensing their software. Elastic, Mongo, Redis, Sentry. Companies that were built around open source projects. Projects that even accepted contributions from people like you and me because of a technicality, when their investors were displeased with the returns that they were getting on those projects, because of a technicality, these companies were allowed to relicense those projects and make them no longer available to you, the contributor, author of some contributions, under that same license. Critically, these are examples, when you read the news, it's critical to understand that these are examples of, yes, there's an open source license. Yes, there's even open collaboration to a degree, but no, there is not any open governance here. And this is one area where foundations come in. No project governed by a nonprofit foundation is gonna pull that kind of nonsense with their community. There are other challenges with foundations, don't get me wrong. They are not a panacea and they're hard work and we have to hold them accountable. But they don't have the profit motive to just blanket relicense this open source project that you might have built your career on, that you might have contributed untold hours to. Think also about the slew of security issues that have been hitting the news. Open source software supply chain attacks, squatting on package managers, unauthorized changes to authoritative code bases like PHP just a couple days ago. A lot of that can be chalked up to uneven standards of care, often correlated with uneven resources and projects relying on overworked volunteer maintainers. Foundations are also a channel through which funding can flow to pay maintainers. There are many foundations that pay a small staff of core contributors to keep those projects ticking. That's been true to an extent for a while, but we're seeing a big uptick in that. And I think we're gonna see more of that. Paying maintainers so that they can get the job done and take care of this software is another important way to make sure that the software we use is robust and reliable. Like, even setting aside the issues of the day, keeping the lights on at all of these foundations is critical to ensuring we all continue to enjoy the benefits of a large, reliable commons of software that's ready to use, modify, and redistribute. Current events just make the threats to the commons more clear. Now, what is our role as creators and consumers of open source software in light of all this? Look, I went most of my career without knowing foundations existed. I could have probably gone my entire career without even realizing it, even though I was regularly interacting with the Drupal Association and just didn't know it. If foundations remain hidden infrastructure, as this industry just continues to balloon on top of this infrastructure, this foundation that exists for us all, if these nonprofits remain under supported, under recognized, well, they may well continue to host the projects we all rely on, but they're not going to be able to invest in those projects to keep them secure and maintained and constantly evolving in response to community needs. So if nothing else in this talk, if you take nothing else away from this talk, I want you to leave today knowing that there are dozens, if not hundreds of nonprofit foundations that make our work possible, that they are nonprofit. They do need your sponsorship. They do need your individual support. And we need to talk about them. We need to tell our coworkers about them. We need to tell our peers in the industry about them so that we're aware of this foundation that we're all working on top of. So just two very specific takeaways. Please consider looking at the foundations in the space, in the area of the technologies that you use. I listed about half a dozen foundations at least. I can guarantee there's a foundation associated with some of the most popular open source projects that you use. Find those foundations and consider if you can afford it, becoming a paying supporter. Better yet, if you are employed as a software developer or as any sort of contributor in the tech industry, if you are in a company that benefits from open source software, and I guarantee that you are, try to build the case at your company that sponsoring these projects is not just the right thing to do, it's not just generous, but it's absolutely essential in terms of managing that business's risk and long-term viability to make sure that the software you're building on will be here today, tomorrow, and into the future. Thank you so much.